présentation de 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Ouais, ouais. Ja, herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe von...
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to a new edition of our Crisis Talks. We want to talk about colonial violence, and we would like to think about post-colonial remembrance politics and whether this could take in a European framework. My name is Alexander Goebel. I'm a free journalist. As you could see, I have been working in Brussels as for the ARD in Brussels, and then before this I was working in Africa. I have two specialists today. I'm your moderator of the day. So first of all, before we actually start, I would like to start with a welcome speech of Uwe Becker. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy to welcome you in the name of our regional governance and our Minister for Federal and European Affairs of the state of Hessen here in the permanent representation of Hesse in Brussels. The reappraisal of colonial violence, and these are very important topics we want to cover today. Therefore, I would like to thank our partner, the Leibniz Institute for Peace and Conflict Research and the Goethe University Frankfurt-Main, because they participated in the organization of today's event. The questions regarding colonial responsibilities, the reflection, the evaluation of the impact of the history on modern times, the handling of this question, and the question how we can create a remembrance politic, a remembrance culture, taking into account what happened and making, therefore, possible the discussion of today will be the topic of our event. The debate is not only taking place among scientists anymore. We're talking about street names, looted arts, and it's very complex. And it's also this kind of complexity we have to appraise today. Then regarding reparations, payments, all this is very interesting. And the responsibility of European states like Spain, France, Belgium, Italy, Great Britain, and also Germany, this responsibility makes the topic quite European. And therefore, it is important and it's right to make this discussion here in Brussels to ask the right question. And even if we're in good faith, it's very difficult to handle this topic. And we have the example of the Benin bronzes with the question, where should we give these looted art objects back to private owners, to museums? And there we see how supposed thieves really want to take part in the discussion regarding what they have been looting. Very important, very interesting historical topic. And I wish you a very interesting and very successful discussion. Since the development of a post-colonial culture and the limitation of every question to the colonial period is very, very, very difficult, and we really have to put everything together in order to find the right answers. Therefore, I wish you a very successful event. I thank you for your participation. Yeah, thank you. As we said, it's an event of our crisis talks, cooperation of the permanent representation of the state of Hessen together with the Leibniz Institute for Peace and Conflict Research and the Goethe Institute Frankfurt. For our audience, we have interpretation. We have interpretation into English and into French. It's a live stream event. We have interpretation for the streaming and here for the audience on site. And I have many, many questions I would like to ask, but we want to keep this event very interactive. So therefore, you can ask your questions right here. And when you're participating via the stream, you can put your question via the chat function. Maybe we can collect all these questions at the end of our event to answer them together. And then we have the mail addresses, streamline at m-v-lv-essen.de, or you can also call us. And there we also see this phone number and this email address in our streaming. Then I would like to invite and to welcome Dr. Sabine Mannitz. She will also come to the panel here. But first of all, she will represent here Dr. Stefan Kroll from the Leibniz Institute for Peace and Conflict Research. Well, there is actually a strike of the German railway. Therefore, he's not here today, and therefore it is Dr. Sabine Mannitz who is representing him.
Ja, ganz herzlich.
Thank you. Thank you for this kind invitation, for these nice words. I really would like to ask you to forgive me. I have I have some problems with my voice. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you today. So you could see Stefan Kroll for a second during the introduction, but he is a victim of the German railway strike. So he's not with us today, and therefore it's me who will thank you today and give an introductory speech. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm working at the Leibniz Institute, as you could hear, and I'm working at the Research Center Transformation of Political Violence, and Stefan Kroll is my colleague in both programs. So we are really connected and participating in different cooperation structures. I really would like to thank all the organizations that participated in today's event. We would like the permanent representation of the state of Hesse, Mr. Heusinger, Ms. Parisi, then the community of Leibniz represented by Ms. Labisch, then the research center of the Goethe University, and the direction Rebecca Schmidt. Then we would also like to thank the research network coordinated by Dr. Stefan Kroll. He's not here today, but I really would like to thank him for his work regarding that kind of events. Now I switch to my speech, to my keynote speech. It's a fact. When we talk about colonial violence and remembrance politics, I'm really always very happy to see that people are very interested in this topic. And it's maybe due to the positive evolution in the public debate. But as you could read in the invitation, the reappraisal is still taking place within the framework of national politics. I'm not talking about academics, because we have an international academics or scientific discussion regarding different phenomena of violence, their comparability, their connection. And when we take a look at these questions, we really see the interaction between imperialism and colonialism and this network, this complex network of the European states. Today, I would like to talk about the political practice regarding how to handle colonialism, how to handle the question of looted arts. State Secretary Uwe Becker was talking about the Benin bronze. It's a very good example, since these art objects have been sold in Europe and then finished in European musea. And the question from Nigeria have been handled at national level in very different way. In 2017, France was the first state to offer another kind of a dialogue regarding the Humboldt Forum. And there we had then the connection with the construction of a museum. Then we have Great Britain. There, these bronzes are still in British musea. For Great Britain, it's a kind of national heritage. And there they say, okay, it's our objects, it's our art objects, it's our remembrance of the former power of Great Britain. And here I would like to argument. It should also be part of European politics. The reappraisal of our colonial past should happen in a kind of proactive way, not just when we have wars and then political interests make a peaceful solution impossible. Now, giving back the Benin bronzes to Nigeria, there Hermann Perzinger said, I quote, "There is no global cultural cooperation with countries that have been stealing your art objects." And I would like to go a step further. Our research wants to reach peace. So when we are talking about the reprisal of the violence, we describe different solutions aiming at peace. We want to understand, to anticipate what happens, what makes violence possible in order to be able to avoid them in the future. And then we want to take a look at the different normative orders, orientations, cultural identities we are currently building, and what would be the impact on the possibility of peace. So it's not only about a cultural cooperation, it's about the creation of relations where we try to fight structural violence. Regarding the post-colonial perspectives, it's very important to see colonialism not as something that has been closed. The incompleteness of colonial history, the after effects of colonial conditions in global power constellations, the forms of knowledge production, the meta-narratives of the history of the world and of existing inequalities are still having an impact. Howard French said in an impressive history that a relational entanglement of developments in former colonies and the centers of colonization and that colonial expansion created the preconditions for Western modernity. The post-colonial perspectives, it's a very important role they play. They can help to uncover the past in order to have a change in paradigm. And the empirical findings show that people really insist on their colonial history. The reappraisal of the colonial history has gaps even in countries with a long colonial history, and we can't find any perspectives in school textbooks, for instance. And therefore, colonial history is very often seen as a closed chapter of the past, and continuities and the long-lasting effects and changing effects are rarely addressed. And then, as I've already said, dealing with Europe's colonial legacy of violence remains in general within the national framework. In order to make things more visible, we all very often have to rely on the civil society being part of a kind of a bottom-up approach. And regarding new names, for instance, for street names in German, that's one of the examples. Then we have the national politics, and that's also always a kind of tactic. So we are apologizing, yes, no, we want to help in your development, we don't want to pay reparations. And the former colonies are really taking note of this. And if we take into account of the German relationship with Namibia, these tensions become very clear. And we're still trying to get a kind of reconciliation agreement. And now I would like to talk about the need of action for the European level.
An enlargement of the perspective is necessary in order to understand, in order to do something about the future in education. And coming to grips with colonial is not only nationally required, but to be seen as a common European project in order to really shape the learning about it and to decolonize, in order to bring further developments and the knowledge and to anchor this in the past. One step would be that to strengthen the transnational civil engagement and to really make it more systematic, but also regarding the restitution policy, much more than so far, One should look beyond the nations, and therefore, thereby from Brussels, there are also impulses possible. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be able to go in to discuss this with you.
Ja, da möchte ich meine Panelisten.
Well, I would then like to ask the panelists to come to the stage, and our observers who are online looking at us can also ask their questions online. I'm very happy that the two of you are here. The EU deputy was also going to be here. It's a pity that she cannot be here with her French-Algerian background. Most unfortunately, she fell ill. And of course, we wish her all the best. Very briefly on you, Mrs. Mannitz, because you have so many roles. You're a political scientist at the Frankfurt Leibniz Institute on the TIF. You are a member of the board, and you are also principal investigator regarding the research of transformation of political violence. And I would like to welcome Lerida Ganza. You are independent consultant, and you are convinced about the transformative force of art and culture. I think we can come back to this in the discussion. In your work, you are mainly concentrating on decolonization in the cultural sector and also in development aid. It's very nice to have you here, so we can start. So let's see. There's an African saying, which some know perhaps, until the lions have their own history, hunting histories are always being glorifying the hunter. I do like this saying because it is showing us that it is a question of the perspective from which the tales are being told. Lawrence, can you do something about this saying?
I think it's a very clear saying, and I think it's interesting that it's coming from Africa. It says a lot that we needed a saying like that to make our struggle more clear. I also think that coming from a country like Belgium, who struggles a lot with having a national history and a national identity, we've also taken advantage a lot of this ambiguity. I don't want to go too far already, but I do think it's the perfect way to start this talk.
Das freut mich sehr. Wie geht's Ihnen damit?
Ja, ich muss das noch anschalten.
Ja.
Yeah. It is very pertinent to see the power of disclosure, which is expressed in this saying. And this is something which we should really deal with, dealing with culture. Those who had the power were really defining the tales. Yeah, this fits, because a few meters only, we are close to Philip Leopold II, the Belgian king, and he has really made Congo his private property. And his reign was responsible for terrible crimes. And then this went on in Belgium, Congo, and in 2020, there were mass protests in Belgium, and statues of Leopold II were painted in red. And Laura, we have already learned by Sabine Mannitz that there was this pressure from the civil society. So to what extent this was needed to get some more dynamics into this process, which had fallen asleep for decades.
It was vital to have this process. It was very visible in 2020, but I think it's important to say that ever since there was a Belgian Congo, there was resistance. There were people fighting against it. There were people trying also to educate other people about this question in Belgium. I do think of people like Léon de Witt, who have been working tirelessly since the early 2000s to make this more visible. I'm thinking of writers like David van Reybrouck, who have written a beautiful book about Congo, who made this a subject that is now being discussed all across the world. And of course, of like countless activist groups, such as BAMCO, such as Collectif Mémoire Coloniale, who've been working on this subject. I think 2020 was really a moment where they were able to come together and seize an opportunity to be visible on this question, and that Belgium kind of had no other choice than to respond. I think the difference really in that period is that not only was it a national movement, it was an international movement. And with those type of international solidarity, it becomes easier to put a subject on the agenda. And I don't think it was out of goodwill that the state started doing something. It's really out of fear. And any politicians will tell you that at some point you do have to answer to your constituents, and you do have to be clear on what you're going to do. We will discuss this. I don't know if you want to discuss the statue right now, but I do think the statue is very emblematic because it's very clear, it's huge. You cannot really miss it if you come to Brussels. But if you look across Brussels, all of Brussels is built on colonial money. All those beautiful buildings that were built during the Art Deco period in Belgium, the Art Deco period was funded by colonial money. And I do think that for a lot of people, you can walk around the streets of Brussels and not see it, but the moment you know it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot walk in front of the Royal Palace here in the center of Brussels and not ask yourself, how was this small country who was freshly built, freshly created in the middle of the 19th century, where did you get the money to build all this? Where did they get the money to become, at some point, the second world power? Where did they get the money to build those railways? And once you start asking yourself, where did they get the money, you always come back to Congo. And I am not Congolese, I'm from Rwandese descent, but I can only imagine what it must feel like to come from Congo and walk around and see your money being displayed like this. So yes, 2020 was definitely an important moment, but it was decades and decades coming.
Sabine Mannitz, diese Denkmäler, von denen wir gesprochen haben.
And these monuments which we spoke about, can we contextualize this? Because this is not only true in Belgium, but also in Germany. Maybe it's less visible. I would say either or, and I think that by monuments, one should really discuss them in a different way than about street names. And for instance, there's an excellent material conception to deal with street names, for instance, in the city of Hamburg, where it was shown how coming to grips with history can go hand in glove, that streets are being renamed, but also monuments can be, for instance, in Hamburg-Wandsbek, there are names according to a very successful merchant who was very famous in Hamburg. So, along with street names, you can deal in a different way than with monuments, and because they have a different impression due to their shaping and due to their development. But regarding the process of coming to grips with, for instance, I was in Canada, and the former Prime Minister MacDonald was taken down from as a statue from the socle, and we see an empty socle now, and we need dignitaries to come down from their pedestal, and the more responsibility is being taken for certain shapes of violence, all the better it is, and all the less it can be legitimized to having these honoring. And we should also mention one building. It's the African Museum in Tervuren. It was for a long time a totem of this historic mission. I do not know where we can start. I mean, there's a long history and there's a certain makeover also. Is it possible for this museum to do what has been done with naming this? And how would you describe this way? It's a very difficult topic also for Belgium.
So the question is whether we can decolonize.
Yeah, genau. How do you think about
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think if I had the answer, the Belgian state would give me a medal or something. But
make it short.
yeah, I will try to make it short. I think the museum is a very good example of how Belgium deals with difficult subjects. We're not good at making decisions. We're not good at deciding at some point this is what we're going to do. So yeah, I think it was in 2005 that they decided to close it for renovation. And the idea was this is going to be a brand new museum. This is going to be a museum that is no longer a colonial one. And I will leave everyone to decide whether or not it is no longer a colonial museum, but I think it's a museum who refused to decide. It's a museum who refused to decide whether or not they're going to stay in the past and continue showing this vision that Belgium has of itself as this savior of Congo, or if it's going to move forward by acknowledging its past. And it's doing none of those things, and both things at the same time, and it's very messy, and no one understands really this museum. I walk through it all the time. I work with the museum a lot, and I always tell people, if you're gonna visit, take a guide, because no one knows what they're trying to tell. And I think it really comes to this problem that Belgium doesn't know how to tell its own story. We're not very good at building identity. And I think when we talk of politics of memory, it's very much linked to this idea of a national identity and how do we tell our story. Belgium is a very divided country since its creation and has never been really good at saying what is a Belgian person. What does it mean to be Belgian, and what does it mean to live in this country? What is our common history? And of course, colonization is a subject that I think a lot of researchers call the great forgetting in Belgium. We just don't talk about it for a long time. It's not that we were proud of it. We were not having loads and loads of museums like the British do, where we like to show we used to be a big empire. We're not really proud of it. We just forget about it. And I think the museum tried to do that and is incapable of doing so because it is such an image. It is almost laughable that they are trying to do this. And at the same time, I think we should not forget that the museum is also an institution that's composed of lots of people with very conflicting ideas and vision of what the museum should be. And until Belgium decides to take a decision on what this museum is going to be, it's going to continue being this thing that we don't know how to use, that is useless for people who believe colonization was great, because they cannot really prove that with this museum. And it's useless to the activists who would try to do something better with it. I remember when the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin appointed their new director, I was thinking this could never happen in Belgium, because it would require us to have the guts to take a decision and say we are going in this direction, which we are not doing at the moment.
Wenn wir das mal auf eine höhere Ebene noch heben mit diesem Problem des Entscheidens.
Higher level of decision making. What do you think? If we regard the political reappraisal, for Germans, it's also very difficult to apologize. The question is, do we really want to have a kind of remembrance. So how should we handle this if we are even unable to talk about this? I would like to join you. So it was very difficult to hide things. No? There comes the point when silence is not an option anymore. I think this is very due to the change in public media. And this is something we could see during our research in different countries. We have activists working for decades, trying to show the kind of violence that happened, and they didn't have the possibilities in the past, the possibilities the social media offer today. And now we have a kind of different momentum. And then we had publications. I would like to quote Bénédicte Savoy regarding Africa and the looted arts. These are, let's say, a net impact. So we have a coming together of different factors, and then the public speech comes into a direction where doing as if and keeping silent is not an option anymore. We can't defend the position of a great history anymore. This is one question. And then we have the question regarding the political reaction. Very interesting. I have been doing lots of interviews also in Canada, and there the survivors said apologies is very important, but it's also a moment of power. Politicians saying, I apologize, really bring me in a situation where I have to accept. And then they always said, okay, apologizing is okay, but then we need truth. We need truth, we need a reappraisal, and then we need a constructive handling of the truth, which not means you don't have to apologize, but apologies are not enough. We really need concrete steps for ongoing cooperation, economic cooperation, not limited to development aid or cultural cooperation at one level, and not this kind of modus. Okay, now we did apologize and it's done. Okay, yeah. Yes, and we currently have the impression that everybody wants to apologize. So we had King Charles III in Kenya, then we had the German federal president Steinmeier in Tanzania. Then in Namibia, it was a little bit more difficult for us, but it's very interesting to see. So we have Abdurazak Gona, Nobel Prize laureate. He asked the Germans really to take a very honest approach of reappraisal. How do you see the reaction? And second question, how can we make all these discussions a bit more credible? Yeah, I think this is right after the apologies of Mr. Steinmeier. Well, during a research project of my department, we ask ourselves, why isn't Tanzania asking for more apologies, payments, and so on? And this speech we know from the German-Namibian relations, Ms. Wietrecht-Zeul asking, apologizing like years ago, and then behind closed door, how can we handle this? How can we get a reconciliation? This has always been limited to Namibia, to German Southwest. And then we had Machi Machi in German Eastern Africa, where we had really comparable violence and many more victims. So this was astonishing. It was astonishing to see that for a very long time we had no critics regarding the German position regarding Tanzania. And I think this is a kind of typical feature of this victim responsible relation. We keep silent until we can't keep silent anymore. And this is what I mean by becoming proactive. It's in our interest to work on what our ancestor did in the world. And it's also in our interest to face our history, to practice remembrance politics, to work on the facts instead of waiting until we're at a kind of limit and then we start to apologize and start our negotiations. So it's all about proactiveness. It's about our decolonization, actually.
I like to quote the scholar Patrick Wolf, an Australian scholar who worked on settler colonialism, who said invasion is a structure, not an event. And I think often we want to undo colonization by those big events, by a big apology, or by saying the museum now is decolonized because we are not going to show these statues anymore. It is bigger than that. I mean, decolonization did not happen one day out of nowhere. It took time to convince citizens here in Europe that they were superior to other citizens. It took time to create systems that would allow to invade other systems. So of course, the decolonization, it needs to happen in visible, monetary ways as well, but it also needs to be a decolonization of the mind. And it needs to be a restructuration of the way we think about ourselves as Europeans and how we think about other people as Africans, as Tanzanians, whatever. Like, we need to rethink those relations in a way that is bigger than just like material decolonization. So yeah, absolutely, we need to decolonize ourselves first and foremost, but I am always a bit afraid of questions of decolonizing ourselves and questions of apologies, because this is the easy way. This is very easy. Decolonizing yourself seems very hard, but at the end of the day, it is not as hard as when Congo will start making the math and asking for actual money. And that's going to be a harder step. But to get there, yeah, of course, we need to start by decolonizing our mind. We need to start by rethinking our relation to the world.
Bis wir zu einer Restitution kommen, ist es ja noch...
Well, there is still a long way to go. You were talking about Heidemarie Wieczorek-Zoil, Minister for Development, and she did her apologies, and this could have led to reparation, but regarding restitution of looted arts, for instance, if we think about the Benin bronzes, it did actually not happen the way we imagined. And it was not given back to those entitled, actually. Yes. We have this kind of museum strategy, restitution politics. We are very at the beginning in Germany. Other countries are much further. But this question of the Benin bronzes was a very prominent case, since the question in Germany was very quickly, okay, can we accept these statues going back into private property? And then the question, what will we do with our museum? This museum will be empty and so on. So lots of questions in the beginning. And now I would say, okay, we are a little step further and we are, let's say, creating our own competences. And therefore, I have the impression that we did a certain step since during our discussions, the perception we have of each other changes. Okay, so doing as if in Africa we had no really cultural achievements, okay, and then on the other hand saying, okay, these bronzes from the 16th, 17th, 18th century will be exposed as big treasures in our museum. This is really a contradiction, a huge contradiction. And now we had the spotlight on this contradiction and showing therefore the cultural achievements, the governance, the governmental structures Africa had when Europe was still quite far away from this, okay? So, of course, it didn't really go smoothly. It was a kind of paternalistic touch from the German part saying that, okay, we give it back to you, but you put it into a museum and we will pay for it. Since how it actually should be self-evident. If I stole something and then I give it back, it's up to the people I give it back to do whatever they want to with it. And now we have the kind of temporary collection. So there are some possibilities of consensus, but I really think this topic has to be discussed. Yeah, one question, if we want another mindset, a mindset of a more sustainable approach regarding colonialization and reappraisal, it's not that easy if, on the one hand, the African say that we are talking about Africa like being one country, a kind of unidimensional approach, and then Africa is always represented as if it should be a victim of colonialization. And then we have the second point, saying that Africa is just one country, a kind of reduction. And then, as you said, leaving the past behind, the kind of contradiction. How can we find an answer? It's a very important point requiring an answer to make sustainable reappraisal possible.
I would quickly say something. It's very important that there should be a cooperation at the same level in science. We see it is so difficult to really get interested African colleagues and to get them here to Germany. Partly they do not get visa when they want to go to conferences here. My colleagues who are working on peace building, they are going to Ghana today. There's a big workshop where we are committed and we are meeting the colleagues, because otherwise only 1/3 of the persons would come to Germany. Despite all the invitations, confirmations, this kind of misapprehension has to be addressed. And there it is very important that we have a good cooperation.
Das war eine sehr lange Frage, die ich hatte.
It was a
ging so ein
very
bisschen
long question. It was a
diesen
question
Widerspruch,
of
den wir
the contradiction which we have to dissolve between, on the one side, non-one-dimensionality of colonial Africa, but on the other side to not simply put aside the past as though everything had been.
I don't really see a contradiction there. I do think to be able to see Africa in a multidimensional way, you don't have to forget the past. You do have to embrace it and to learn it, but learn it before colonization. That is really the difficulty, I think, for a lot of scholars now who are trying to embrace a decolonial point of view, is to not start the history of Africa in the middle of the 19th century, but to start it way before that, which is difficult when you've also committed an epistemicide where we've lost knowledge and networks of knowledge in those places and in those indigenous knowledge that we will never get back, actually. So we are really at this very difficult moment in time where we are realizing, okay, to understand our present, to understand what is going on, we do need to go back way before colonization, but what do we do when we've erased all of that and when we've created systems that do not allow us to go as far? As you were saying, I think it's extremely important to have those voices from the global south be also around the table to help us understand how do we teach this better. Belgium has been working a lot around the decolonization of education, mainly in the southern part of the country, in the French-speaking part of the country, because as a lot of you know, Belgium is very divided on a lot of things, and our educational systems are not the same in Flanders and in Wallonia. But Wallonia has been working a lot around the question of how do we decolonize education, and the first step was, okay, we need to teach students and children about colonization, because we don't, when I was still in school, we did not learn about colonization of Belgium. We did learn about the colonization that France did. We did learn about colonization of Algeria, but we did not learn about Congo. So that is a first step, but then there comes the whole idea of how we tell history, or how we teach history, is around those colonial ways of thinking. I was taught about the great discoveries of the Americas, and that is already setting in mind that there are some people who are allowed to discover and other people who are just the background that we discover. And that is, it is complicated. I do think we like to take the decolonization debate and put it in a box that is very separated to the rest of our society, which is not the case. As we can see when we discuss, it touches on culture, it touches on education, it touches on science, who's allowed to do science, who's allowed to travel, to do research, on decolonization, but on any type of subjects. I work in the cultural and art sector. There's the question of who's allowed to make art, who makes art and who's doing craft, who makes art that can be shown across the world, and who makes art that should only talk about racism. And all those questions, I do believe that through a better educational system that embraces various ways of seeing the world and that teaches students not this is how the world works, but here are the histories of the world and here are the different points of view that we have, we can have new generations that are way more open-minded. And we can already see the effect of those kind of things. I spend way too much time on TikTok watching Gen Zers talking about colonization, and it's fascinating because I'm thinking, you're 12. You're 12 and you have more knowledge than my neighbor who lived through colonization. And you know way more than her because we've been already embracing new progressive ways of teaching history, and it's already showing its effects.
Wenn es diese progressiven Kräfte und Dynamik,
when there are these progressive forces, then it is really a chance for the whole thing of being this topic to be discussed in Europe. And that is the topic of our event. How can we really learn from colonialism in order to bring about a new European narrative, which includes this? The name of our center, Transformation of Political Violence, can also be understood in a way that we ask, what can we do in order to transform the history of violence? And to bring about a new understanding, I would like to underline the normatives of the discourse in school books, I think, is still a very relevant share with which we can work, despite new teaching materials and the school book, which comes along with the claim of really telling the truth in the classroom, is really a decisive item. And therefore it is of no minor importance what is written in the school books, how this history of violence is being told. It's a very important lever. But of course, political socialization is not only taking place in the classroom, and it is not only something which concerns the young people. So the public discussion about it is just as important, be it the museums, the street names, and how we do we tell European history. That's a very, very important factor.
möchten Sie noch antworten?
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add. I think you're absolutely right that the question of what's on the street names, on the museums, because these are all public spaces that do inform the way we see ourselves and the way we see our history. Thank God history is not only told by historians, but it's told by everyday people and by everything we see around us. And there are great opportunities in changing the narrative by changing those more visible aspect of everyday life. But I really want us to be able to go a step further and really think, how do we decolonize things that do not seem like they need decolonization? I was talking about art and culture. We are often confronted with this idea of like some people, they do primitive art, even the notion of primitive art. And then there are others who are able to set the canon for beauty and set the canon of what is considered art or not. And this seems very frivolous and not important, but all those little things added up to one another do create a worldview that is very hard to deconstruct later. So when we talk decolonization, we are always talking about public spaces and museums and education, and I do think these are the cornerstone of how we can move forward. But we should really strive to go further and see on how in our everyday life, how are our choices informed by this worldview that we do not see anymore.
Mit Blick auf die Uhr würde ich mal in die Runde fragen, wir haben nicht mehr viel Zeit, aber Fragen gibt es ja vielleicht. Und
perhaps there are some questions and perhaps a microphone. So please be precise. I'm from the green ones, the first green one in the European and very active in Africa. Very, very good. And I would, but there were two things which I found remarkable. You said you can maintain the pedestals of these statues, and otherwise we are in the tradition of the Soviet photos where they are truce made. And an excuse was very important. Willy Brandt has done this. And no French president, no American president have so far dared to bring out their apologies. National and European, but to implement all this and to be proactive, there one should also think about twinning. For instance, in the 60s, the twinning between various cities, for instance, with Nicaragua, and with Central and Eastern Europe, and with states of the former Soviet. Why not twinning with cities and villages and schools with the global South? And the second item, and there is a twinning between Rheinland-Pfalz, which is twinned with Rwanda. And the second question, those who were mentioned, the countries, there are more countries to it. Let's think of Denmark, which has colonized Ghana in order to take part in the slave trade and was very well positioned, and even Brandenburg, who were also active in slave trade. And think of the Netherlands, who were not even mentioned yet. So there are many. This, of course, we cannot complete here today yet. Thank you very much for the two questions. Very briefly, of course, you're fully right. The list of the countries can be extended, and there are many forms regarding an exchange, and also where partnerships can be considered. So I fully agree with you regarding the excuses. I do not want to put this down, but from the view of those who are concerned and who have survived, it has been clearly said, the people I talk to, that it is the first symbolic gesture, but what comes afterwards is much, much more important. Another question? I'm from the House of History. Two important. we are preparing a special exhibition which is going to start in February regarding what is the attitude of the European states regarding the colonial past. Secondly, we already have now an example of how colonies and European states can be compared with each other. We have a mask from the Belgian Congo and a lithography from Schmidt-Rottluff. And we say the expressionism in Europe has been influenced by African art. Thank you very much for the hint. One more question from the lady. Thank you very much. I have a question to Mrs. Mann. Benedicte Savoy has taught something about the French work. And could you imagine that a similar work could be realized at European level? And a project of restitution at European level could be brought ahead?
The first one would be, how can we keep up the spirit of 2020 so that we don't lose that energy that was there, and how can we keep that up? And one other question would be more of a service question. So do you know any formats that confront the colonial history of Brussels and that you could recommend to the audience?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
How can we keep the spirit of 2020? I think a lot of activist groups have kept the spirit of 2020. I really think that we can see that there was an emergence of a lot of groups that were active but had not a lot of visibility, and now they've gained visibility and they really used it to be able to normalize their presence on political debates, in the parliaments, as experts, that there's a real power that has come from that. I think the question is, how do the people who claim to be allies, how do they keep the energy? And that is a question that I cannot answer because I can only talk about my experience, and I am not white, so it's really hard. But I do think that there are so many ways nowadays to be active on those questions, that the question is not so much like how do we keep the movements active, but how do I myself see myself in those movements? What can I bring to those movements? I'm thinking to not talk about something where I'm not an ally. Let's talk about the question of the hijab. That is really not linked to this, but more linked to the movements that were happening in Belgium 2-3 years ago to allow women with the hijab to go to colleges and universities here in Belgium. And to remain, to keep this opportunity for them. There were a lot of movements that created a real change in the law, and that was great. Now what do? I'm not a woman with a hijab, so I could stop here and be like, I've done my work as an ally. I think my work now is that I have a stage and I can remind people of those subjects. And I'm using the space that I have to create this change. I think you're a student because you're taking a lot of notes. I do think there is power in what you're going to do with your studies, in which papers you're going to write and which places you're going to go with those privileges to bring up the subject again and make people uncomfortable, but to make sure that it doesn't become something that is in the background of everyone's mind and that is so 2020 and we've forgotten it. I do think this is something you can do. I cannot go for each person and tell them what to do, but this is a place to start. And you had a second question that I forgot. I'm so sorry.
Ich glaube, es gab noch die Frage an Sabine Mannitz zum Thema Europa und Restitution.
Yeah. There was a question on Europe and restitution. I think this is a very good possibility from the European policy to get things going. Of course, there are individual research projects at local level, initiatives, which are also networking across the borders. But in order to have more power and impetus, it's a very good possibility. Do we have time for one more question? For the live stream. Thank you very much for the discussion. And from European African view the arguments. You have spoken about a certain materialism regarding the decolonization, and this is exactly important. I think with European violence in the colonial world, we have really have some guilt. And now we are still having wars between nations and worldwide, and I'm asking myself how we can overcome this. Omnilateralism would perhaps be a solution, and we can relativize the relations. And the nation is often not fully sovereign. There are multi-level governances. Is this a possibility also for Africa? The African Union is on the way to it. To what extent can this help to get Europe and Africa to the same level of cooperation?
We get the tricky questions today.
Yeah. The African Union is not very effective, and it's not very competent. I hope I will never have to apply for a job there, but it's not very useful. So yeah, maybe one day the African Union can become a tool for those African countries to reclaim power and to sit at the table in front of European countries and be considered as equal. Absolutely, but I do think the African Union was created with this idea. It was created with the idea of like, okay, there's a European Union, there will be an African Union that can be just as strong, but African countries don't have the same history as European countries, don't have the same interests. It works for the European Union because the countries are also strong by themselves, a lot of them. Belgium could not survive without the EU, but Belgium was not a country that was at the risk of disappearing when the EU was created. So it was created in a context that's totally different from the African Union. So is the African Union ever going to be the EU? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it so far. But it is very interesting to think that we keep on asking those African countries to change the way they are to be able to be considered as sovereign and as powerful as the European Union. At the end of the day, diplomacy it's not just a question of do you have the right shape, it's do I accept the shape that you have. And we can continue asking those African countries, like, once you do this, and once you do this, and once you do this, you will be considered a sovereign nation. But the problem is that European countries get to decide who are sovereign nation. It's not whether or not those countries are or whether or not they're good enough. It's why do we still have this power? Why do we still get to be the judge and arbiter of who is a sovereign nation and who gets to work freely and who is invaded every other day? So hopefully the African Union, one day, they will have balls and they will do something, but at this moment in history, they're not, and they've proven multiple times that they will do whatever the European Union asks them to do, or they will do nothing, which is sometimes also very convenient for us. So I will not count on them. I will count on the countries where I am at and where I can protest and where I can vote better to have governments who accept that they're not worldwide decider on who's right and who's wrong. And I think the change has to come from our side and not from the side of African countries.
Funktioniert nicht, oder? Ja.
Just let me add, regard the frontiers, we have the argument that Europe is responsible for the kind of Balkanization of Africa due to the colonial frontiers, let's say, which is a very important dimension. And the dematerialization of our discussion, there I would like to point out that many of the artifacts we're talking about are a part of a context. We're giving a kind of heritage back, and then we contradict the narrative of the European modern approach and the incapability of the African civilizations. So we really have this kind of Eurocentric ideology which made this possible, and really have to fight this. Thank you very much. If I take a look at my watch, I think we have to stop here, even if I hope we all could see that it's actually a discussion that is just starting. Then 23rd of November, we have a European elections event regarding the elections in the Netherlands. Then I would like to thank Sabine Mannitz and Ganza. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you very much also to the audience, and see you next time.
Thank you.